Hello, sir. How's your day so far?
Good.
Please grab a seat. I would love to say we prepped this conversation. We sort of did, but remotely and not directly, so tell me to shut up. I know you're always willing to do that. I wore my jacket because you liked it so much last time round.
Yeah, that was a well-intended compliment.
I took it as such. How do we take the Netherlands to the next level? That was the topic I was sort of thrown by Rutger and the team. I think we've got a slide coming up with some topics that we can talk about. We should be able to see it in front of us if we can get a clicker. But let's, before we get into that, talk about, you saw some of the teams this morning or just after lunch. What was your feeling?
Well, it was good to see them after Groningen.
Yep.
And what I really like is this kind of continuum. We started in The Hague, in the Hall of Knights,
yep.
and which was very conceptual still, and to see how it's progressing, and then again 100 days further, how much more concrete it has become, and that's very exciting. Because also it now comes into the space where you can really start helping people, because it's connecting to real problems and real organizations that can actually need those applications and these solutions. So
yeah,
it's very good.
One of the things that was becoming clearer for me with the teams I saw is now the real questions for help are becoming clear, whereas 80 days ago it was we need everything, which is of course just not practical. And now it's, okay, we need a connection to this organization, or we do need to raise some funds, and yes, we've got to figure out the business model to make that viable, but this is where we can really start propelling, I think. We've got some topics. Some of these are tough topics. I'm not an expert in this. I don't even know if you are, to be honest. But I think you have a pretty good oversight, certainly from a startup world. But you do so much far more than just the startups. Regulatory framework. I do have some notes here. For example, the ICO world. This is becoming a thing, and we see some countries just shutting it down entirely. We see some countries attempting to embrace it, but trying to create some sort of responsible control mechanism, and yet we've still got to be out in this fuzzy edge of doing new things. Mm-hmm. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think you put it very well. No, I think this is actually the challenge, but probably there's even a worse middle way where you don't give any clarity. So there's always the threat of shutting it down. So I think there has to be more clarity if you want to, because that's the question, right? The next level for the Netherlands, if you want to put the Netherlands higher up there with in the countries where blockchain is really will really take off, I think you need to create much more certainty around ICOs, role of tokens, and that means being open to innovation on the one hand, having the right processes to address these new ideas in a very open sense, but also kind of setting clear boundaries of what's not acceptable. That can be very, very good as well. I mean, if you could, for instance, differentiate yourself as a country, as a place where you have very, very high standards for ICOs, but you become like the certificate for high quality ICOs. Most people in the space will say that 80% of what's going on now is not that. It's basically crap.
It's the Wild West.
So if you can actually make sure that the 20% is actually happening here, because there's very high standards, and the people at the regulator really know what they're talking about, and they really think constructively along with the entrepreneurs, that would be a real asset to the country, I think.
And are we close to being ready for that? I mean, there's the who, how, why, what, where. I mean, there's a rabbit hole underneath that. But
I don't know. You should ask everybody here. I do think that there's a willingness to be pragmatic, but there's also quite a big fear. And also, I think in some of the banking industry of these instruments, and fear is not always the best advisor in cases where you really want to embrace innovation. So I think we're definitely not there yet, but we do have, at least we have a government that's experimenting a lot with blockchain. So there's a big willingness there, and that's the first part, is the awareness and the willingness. And then comes the how, and I think in the how we still need to have a lot of constructive dialogue. But I think first the basic proposition should be that there's an openness to think constructively about this.
Yeah. And do we have the right players in place? Because this doesn't strike me as something that can be led by one entity or one organization. This has to be a truly group effort. Do we have the right players in the ecosystem open and becoming awake? Do we need to bring in new stuff?
I mean, you're organizing these blockathons or hackathons where there are where all the relevant people are present. In Groningen, there was member of parliament, there was a state secretary, you got local politicians, you got regulators, central bank, developers, business people, financiers, everybody in the room. So I think this is an excellent space. But I do think it's something you should address very, very specifically, and also connect internationally. I think it's very interesting what they're doing in Singapore. It's very interesting also what they're doing in Switzerland. Estonia has some interesting. So basically learn from each other, but it starts with this kind of very positive attitude towards development. I think in general that's there, but it maybe needs some more.
Yep. You mentioned international, and that's actually third on the list. So let's just go straight into it. I made a comment at the hackathon, and you said, perhaps I could do better to switch my perspective. There are, of course, other places on the planet where they're also doing tremendous things. You mentioned Singapore as an example. Is it important that we connect? No, that's a stupid question. What will connecting to those bring us?
Well, I think you see that many countries, regions will have a specific congregation of talent and also specializations. And it's the Netherlands is quite small, so we really benefit from being as well as possible connected to those communities, so that the ideas and the talent and also the supportive financing and as I said, talent is actually easily accessible in all those spaces. And I think the more we are accessible for international talent to develop here and our talent to go there, I mean, I think we start building a community which is truly decentral and which we shouldn't own. But I think if you really want to be part of a network, you have to be giving as well as taking.
So one of the things you mentioned there is sort of being strong on something but not necessarily owning it. It sounds like having some sort of unique selling points from each of the nodes within that network. So Singapore could be great in X, the Netherlands can be great in Y, but don't try to own it. Make sure we're distributing that as best as possible.
So for instance, what we have in the Netherlands, we have a very strong interest also for the corporate community. We have the blockchain coalition, corporates actually wanting to engage in the space, and we acknowledge it's like a learning event. Corporates are also trying to embrace startups. They're trying to embrace digital transition. Now blockchain comes on top. There are always kind of new technologies that they have to absorb, but at least there's been a quite early awareness and a strong willingness to do this. But as we said there, there's a regulatory framework. If you set the right regulatory boundaries and have a clear framework which is predictable, transparent, and you can deal with compliance easily in the Netherlands, then that would be a really good thing to differentiate yourself from many other places. I think some countries that have a clear system in place are more about control than about opening up and sharing. So that's another thing. If you really provide platform for people to excel when they're here because they get all the inputs that they need. So kind of where you just go down the list, I think a country needs to be specialized in a certain way. You can't be everything to everyone. So if you find that there's a congregation here that's very much around doing, for instance, blockchain for good, or that because you have all these parties that actually are actively collaborating from the corporate world, the government, and the regulators, and entrepreneurs and developers, then that also could be one of the ways that you can stand out. It's definitely, there's also the negative to that. If you don't do that, you stand out negatively, and talent will go somewhere else.
Yeah. And speaking of talent, I mean, blockchain, we have to remember, philosophically, it's the solution to many challenges, but it's still only the tech. It needs people. One of the challenges that we have here in the Netherlands that you and I both work with is developing tech talent, because of course, blockchain is too many steps away from the general person today from making it happen. We're already working as a country and throughout our startup hubs, for example, spread across the country on how do we develop more tech talent, but how do we develop more tech blockchain talent when we're still on that fuzzy edge of we don't even know what we need to learn?
Yeah, but that could be an asset. If it's still very, very open and very exciting, you can still be part of a community that's exploring a new field. Whereas if you're seeing, for instance, informatics, it's so established that what they're teaching in the schools is no longer really applicable. So people, even though we only have, I think, 2,500 informatics students in the Netherlands every year, which is really far too low for the huge demand for this talent. But some of them say, well, what we're learning in the schools is not adequate. So it's a big race for talent. We have the same for AI. It's the same for data science. So we in Den Bosch, not far from here, set up the Data Science Academy. That's also dealing with AI. Blockchain comes on top of that. It's for the traditional educational institutions, this development is just going too fast, and we can't follow with curriculum. We can't follow with the right people. So I think it has to be something that's much more kind of community-based learning, and in places like this, and that is also more involving many more people that are actually practitioners already that are stepping into this than through the traditional education system.
Yeah, and I mean, I see through my work that the traditional education system is just begging for input from for example, the business world to say, we know we're not doing good enough, we want to do better, but you're going to have to help us. So maybe that's where this ecosystem perspective, we always talk about triple helix, but this ecosystem perspective of, what you folks are learning, how can you get that back into some form of education, whether that's formal, traditional, or out of school, doesn't, for me, matter, to make sure that we're spreading it as far as we can. And what I'm seeing is a sort of chicken and egg. The better we do here, the more we can learn, the more we can share what we're learning, the better we can do.
No, that's a virtuous cycle. That's
if we
actually
can
quite good.
kickstart
That's
it,
not a chicken and egg.
Yeah.
That's actually quite good. If that would be the case, it would be great. But we're seeing that, for instance, setting up schools like Godam, which is a kind of very, very top level coding school in Amsterdam based on École 42 in Paris. It's difficult to fill them. It's difficult to find people to actually, especially from the more deprived backgrounds that you want to get into the school. Yeah. So to give them an extra chance to get people to dedicate themselves to a very difficult curriculum. That's been a challenge. So even though you build capacity, doesn't mean immediately you're going to get this waves of new of people coming in. Then we get a whole discussion about foreign students coming to our educational institutions. That doesn't help either, because that's probably where the bigger pool of talent is. So you actually want to bring them in. So there's no easy quick fix. I think but the market pool is evident.
Yeah. You mentioned about specializing. We should pick some things to focus on instead of trying to be everything for anyone. You said a regulatory framework alone could be a differentiator, but do you see hot topics where you think this is where the Netherlands could really stand out?
Well, obviously the Netherlands is quite strong in logistics. We have pensions. I mean, many of these areas are also represented here. Big insurance industry. So I think there are a number of industries where it would be quite likely that the Netherlands could do well, because there's a big demand of companies that where these services are absolutely spot on. So, but even the government. I mean, if the government would really embrace this, then as a government you can actually start becoming, at least as a brand, you can demonstrate yourself as being a blockchain kind of embracing country, but it also can become a kind of an export product. And I see this more as also the cities level, where cities are really branding themselves, and not only to attract talent, but also kind of as platforms for superior public services. And blockchain seems to be one of those technologies that you could really apply well in this framework.
Yeah. It says government as a launching customer and investment. I see those two things as very much related. Yeah. I mean, your perspective from Startup Delta, investment in startup scale-ups, et cetera, is something that we're already working on. But blockchain is a separate thing. If we want to become, and this is my words, not yours, but one of the places to really enable blockchain, we've got to start thinking about how do we invest in the startups in the early days, which is great, bootstrap yourselves, but when you get to scale-ups, we're now hearing from teams saying, okay, to now get to the next level, I need some serious funding. And yep. Is that different to the traditional startup and tech startup world for blockchain, or can we leverage what we've already got and just keep going?
Well, I think the whole ICO way of funding yourself that's definitely new, which is nearly kind of inherent to this set of startups. And if that's not well facilitated, then you take your ICO somewhere else. So that's definitely a differentiator, negative differentiator if we don't get to solve that point. But if you mentioned kind of the role of governments launching customer, I think the government's obviously always quite slow at these things, but I think now in the Netherlands, this whole idea of having entrepreneurs in residence or startups in residence is really taking off. And that's a very easy segue also for kind of blockchain startups to work with the government as this kind of instrument becomes more, people are more akin with the instrument. Because initially it's going to be difficult. You know, someone has, maybe in marketing, has some funny idea of having a startup in residence, and then the people you have to work with are not at least not informed or not trained. They think, what do we? So this takes a few iterations, but then it actually does become an instrument that is quite a driver for innovation in government, and we've seen it been working now in Amsterdam quite successfully, and it's now spreading through the country. So that's a very positive development, I think.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing is, yes, we can use the kind of existing concepts to get some steps further, but there's some new stuff that's got to come in, and if we don't get that right, we're going to put ourselves behind.
Yeah. So we were mentioning with the startup that actually the identity startup. Very key.
Veridon key.
Veridon key. You know, if you start addressing like the big societal problems like sovereign identities, then you are obviously going to hit some very strong maybe supporters on one hand, because you're solving problems that they've not been able to solve in the past, but also some very strong resistance, because you have generations of people trying to crack this nut, and they've always been working on it, and they finally found a solution, and then we come, hey, we got a new solution. And
by the way, it's open.
Yes, by the way, it's open and all, and so that means that, governments will, you have to be aware, and I think the remark made by Rutger about making your stakeholder map is going to be very, very relevant for any kind of blockchain solution, because it will inherently disrupt something. Somebody's going to either lose a power base, or is going to lose maybe their job, or will be in a very different relationship to the certain problem that they have been tasked to solve. And if you're not aware of that, then even though you think you bring a wonderful solution, you will get a lot of resistance because of legacy.
Yeah, I see Rutger sort of coming a little bit closer with a catch box in his hands.
He's crawling.
I'm assuming that means we're going to do an impromptu Q&A perspective. Is that why you've got it in your hand?
This
was not planned.
Too, so because each year we do this. Last year we also asked everybody that was attending, what do you think? And do you have any ideas to take the Netherlands to the next level? Maybe that's also a nice interaction that could happen.
So to the audience, is there, we've covered these topics, and we could talk for hours about this stuff. Can't do that today, but is there something you feel is missing from this list that would enable you or your colleagues to be able to go further, faster, better?
Standards, protocols.
Yeah, there's one all the way at the back.
First in the front, or you want to be macho? See.
Yeah, this is always such a risk. Oh, there goes the camera. Well done.
Done that before.
Outfield. Touchdown.
My name is Claudia, and I think so too that the most important thing to bring blockchain and also cryptocurrencies farther is the regulatory framework. I think that's the biggest challenge at the moment, also for the Netherlands. But I think the big problem is Europe. I mean, we have one Europe, it's fantastic, it's great, but I think there should be a lot more working together to get one framework, one regulatory for this, for example, initial coin offering. This is something I'm very involved with, and I see that in the United States it's very much regulated. In Europe it's not regulated. And I think that's a big problem, because when you get investors to invest, for example, in an initial coin offering, they lose their money because there's so much scam going on. I have this Satis, from the Satis group in New York, they did this, how do you say, this Untersuchung, I'm sorry, I'm German, and they found out that more than 90% are scam. So I think it's very important that the Netherlands works together with Europe to get this regulated as fast as possible.
Yeah.
That's so important to get a blockchain going on, because otherwise investors will lose their trust.
It's-
And
You actually bring a really good point there, because of course we were talking about how to take the Netherlands to the next level, and we talked about internationalization. But we do have this fuzzy thing of the EU sitting
Well,
there
it's not
and
so
saying,
fuzzy, but I think we've had the same problem with EID. It took a long time. And I think these things typically work because there are a few countries that are front runners, and they become the envy of the rest. So you had originally Austria, and which was a front runner in EID, and they did a lot of the heavy lifting to finally come to the EIDAS regulation. And then Estonia is making it for years. Has been their kind of chief kind of marketing topic. And so I do think we should always keep Europe in mind. That would be the ideal solution. But Europe is also a difficult space which has a lot of different interests. And so if you go to Europe without knowing what you want, also without knowing what you will lose, means that people negotiate in a very kind of uncommitted way, and you'll have a commission, they will write studies, and they'll do consultations, and they'll come with some kind of proposal, and before anyone agrees, if they agree, it will be a kind of a consensus mud, pool, which you don't really want, which will not be kind of the excellence that you require. So I would say countries that have the ambition, and at this phase, it's really good that they want to compete for setting the kind of best set of regulations, because that means that there are different views still possible, and then when there's a certain level of maturity, not too mature, because then nobody moves anymore, but then it would be good to actually take that to the European level and see, how these different views actually would work out at a European level, and also then there would be much more legitimacy to do so. But now I've seen this with the open network provision directives that we were drafting in, I think, '97. And it was much too far ahead of the actual developments. And then, so you can write a wonderful directive, but it makes no sense. E-signatures as well was early, I think even in the end of the '90s. And it took another 10 years of consolidation before we finally could manage to put something in place that made sense. Open data, the Open Data Directive, it was then called differently. It was the reuse of public sector information directive.
which says enough.
It was 2001, 2, I think, and it was actually it was drafted in '98, which means that and it didn't go anywhere. Only the UK actually used it effectively. So if you're too early, Europe can also kind of put a brake on these kind of developments.
So you're saying, let's take the lead, do it here, but keep Europe in
Take the
mind
lead,
and share
take
it
the
back.
lead, and also maybe keep an eye out on some other countries that are following a similar line. Try to coordinate with them so that you get a coalition, and then kind of you build a certain level of consensus. So, and if you have one big country in there, you take France or Germany, or you do it with all the Scandinavians, because it's much easier to come to an agreement. But keep the big ones. At least keep an eye on them, because once they got their solution, they will start to kind of bully everybody else to follow suit.
And we're too small to be the bully.
We can, and we are even too small to be the kind of the pit bull terrier that kind of bites you in the heels.
Well, let's hope that comes good for us. We're running slightly out of time, but this is the Next Level conference, and you've been committed since the very early days to this kind of stuff. What's next?
I think next is, I hope this is kind of a flywheel, so that everybody that's here will not be there next time, because they're flown out doing their things, and there's a new generation that kind of picks up the ball. Obviously, I hope really that there's a lot of continuity, and that everybody here is really committed to bring this further, and they will keep investing into this kind of iterative process. But I do think we have to renew ourselves, put new challenges there. I think this board is important. I think for the Netherlands also as kind of a framework of thinking, because many parties are now working on different blockchain solutions, or are claiming to be part of that national map of blockchain initiatives. I think we'll have to start consolidating as well, come up with a certain level of certain degree of prioritization of the items that we really want to get across with the government, or with business, or with academia, and with the community. So and then again maybe with Europe. So that I think is the next level challenge, and then bringing a lot of these ideas and business to real businesses, and seeing them scale up, and create kind of more of a kind of also funding plowing into the system, but also coming out again. So.
And what I've just learned talking to you is that, you know, we made this a very corporate slide with bullet points, but actually this would be better drawn as a sort of interconnected system, because so many of these things rely on each other, right? Getting that talent is going to rely on us being specialized, is going to rely on us having that, you know, this is not a roadmap, this is a big beast.
Yeah, and it's pushing in all directions, because if there's a lot of talent here, and in the early stage, you know, that's great. You know, create a lot of good vibe for talent, but then they start hitting. Once they become more serious, they start hitting regulatory boundaries. Once they've got their business and they don't get investment, they leave again. So, I mean, all of these things start coming together, and it goes really fast. So if we don't get to solve this picture in the next 1-2 years, then much of this kind of very positive energy might just seep away and go somewhere else.
Yeah, and that would be a crying shame.
That would be a crying shame. How's the big building? You have a new big building?
No.
No. Okay.
Speaking of crying.
Speaking of crying.
Thanks for that. No, we'll talk about that later. For me, this was a fascinating and insightful conversation. I hope you guys found it too.
You also had a question still, or not?
Okay, let's do that in the barbecue. I can see these guys saying, we need to get to the next thing.
Barbecue.
Yeah, exactly. No, we're not quite at barbecue time yet. What we're actually going to do next is let you guys get interactive. Rutger talked about it already. We really want your input to what comes to the next level. So in a moment we are, the big brainstorm. I love the initials of that. Thank you so much. I believe we're going to move up to the Stefan's 6th floor. Half of you have been there, so you know where to go, but you're going to take the lead. We're going to head out this door. I don't know if you're joining us or not. I hope so. We're going to go through a whole bunch of quick fire rounds. Of course, it's hip and innovative, so there's going to be Post-it notes all over the place. I'm coming up to join you, so I will guide you through that process. And you've promised me a big bell. Is it there? Is it ready? I can't lift that. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, huge round of applause for Constantijn. Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.